All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for attending our IEP training for the 2022-23 school year. Pretty similar to the ETR training this morning if you were in attendance. Good news is not a lot has changed. Not so good news is we are still missing a little bit of guidance on things that some of the districts have been asking for since last year as far as some specific things go. And I think probably my guess is some of the questions will probably lead to that conversation a little bit later in the presentation. If you were not here this morning, just take a quick second. I am joined by my colleagues. I'm not sure if Erin is here, but Erin Curtis is new to us this year. She came straight from a district as a special ed coordinator. And then Kim Legault was a director of special education, is also a new consultant this year. Barb Knipe, who you guys probably know, and Kristen Millett have since exited the SST. So we have filled those positions with Kim and Erin. Greg Matthews, our associate director, is also on the call today. Most of you guys probably remember him from doing these trainings in years past. And also another special education consultant in our office, Joe Fari, is also joining us today. As far as logistics go, if you guys can please throw those questions in the chat box. If it's like a very nuanced question to a specific situation, that's going to be the best place to put that. If it's more of a general question, feel free to interrupt and we will address that as they come in. Presentation materials are available at the IEP link that you see on the slides, and you guys will have access to the video recording hopefully the early part of next week once it goes through any edits that we might need to make, or also some accessibility things we are required to address prior to posting those videos. Any questions logistically so far? All right. Once again, purpose of today's training, the Ohio operating standards, which we also talked about this morning, can be found here. You guys are all familiar with the operating standards. We encourage you to refer to the operating standards first and foremost. If there's any clarifying questions you need around that, please feel free to reach out. We will give you our understanding based on ODE's guidance in certain areas, but also the operating standards is going to be your best resource for that. The purpose of today's training as well, this is tier 2 training. Tier 1 training is available at the universal support materials for ETRs and IEPs. That is what ODE is instructing the districts to use kind of as that tier 1 support around IEPs and ETRs. You can find that information at those links. That link also includes a voiceover on a PowerPoint presentation straight from ODE, as well as a script that will help you better understand the material. There's IEP, there's ETR, and there's also post-secondary transition. So just a little bit why this is called tier 2 training. We often get that question. The tier 2 training, the intention is that SST provides the train the trainer model to district administrators, lead teachers, department chairs, things like that. And they are then given that information, hopefully enough information to bring back and train their staff accordingly. Tier 3, hopefully none of the districts here fall into tier 3 because of selective reviews on-site. That would be an on-site review from the Office for Exceptional Children. You can also become part of that tier 3 programming, I guess, as a result of complaints, formal complaints that are filed through the Department of Education. This link here goes to the required and optional forms on ODE's website. This is where you're going to find all your PRO1s, your OP insert number here's, and also some static and workable documents for ETRs and IEPs. I know there are some of our smaller districts or community schools that utilize those documents. Keep in mind with the ETR and IEP document, those documents straight off ODE's website do include all of the required components that ODE requires as far as compliance goes with those documents. If your documents look different than those, then just make sure that it includes all those same components that the documents on the website include. Are there any questions so far?
Can you show the link one more time?
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, if you just go to ODE's website and type in required and optional forms in the search bar, the first link that pops up will take you right to that page as well.
Yes, this link is also in, and thank you, Katie, for putting that in there, in the IEP slides. That gives you that hyperlink as well. It's over in the chat if you guys didn't get it when it was sent out with the other message. And real quickly, I just want to tell everybody thank you for your patience as I was moving you from the ETR meeting over to the IEP meeting. So thank you for everybody for working with us during that time.
Yes, thank you. And Erin is here. Erin, I don't know if you want to hop on and just wave and say hi if people didn't see you this morning.
Hi, everyone.
Kim, you're able to admit people, correct? Yes, okay. All right, so I can hide that window and move on. All right, an IEP, keep in mind, is a written legal document developed, reviewed and revised annually at minimal to best identify the specially designed instruction and related services, accommodations, modifications, and support that will enable that school to support that student that has been identified with a disability. Once again, back to the PRO1, this is a required document. I always like to quote Greg Matthews on this one: when in doubt, send it out. You'll never get in trouble for providing too much information and or in trouble in litigation where they say you have too many documentations or PRO1s. So just send those out if you ever have questions. Make sure all of the biggest thing with the PRO1s is that they're individualized and that all of the boxes are filled in. You don't want to get in a situation where you're using, incorrect pronouns or names or things like that because information's been copy and pasted. We unfortunately do see that a lot and often is brought up in some formal complaints around the individualization of the plan for that student. Keep in mind, this document is what the district is proposing or refusing to do, must include the parent input, as well as other options that the team has considered or rejected and why that happened. Make sure you're putting, the team has decided because of, don't make it appear to be like a unilateral decision made by a special education director or one person. This is a team decision, keep in mind, and the parent is a member of that team. This must be provided to the parents prior to implementation of IEP services. Once again, don't leave any boxes blank and do not copy and paste. The link here is a sample PRO1 that we have received from Bricker and Eckler as part of our Acela series. We caution you on using this, use it as a resource, not necessarily something that you're like copying word for word, because it's not necessarily going to be individualized to the student you're referring to. It's going to be more just generally speaking, what components need to be included in that document. On the PR1, the methods of conducting the IEP team review and signature collection should be documented on this as well. Are there any questions about the PRO1? We had a lot of good conversation this morning around that PRO1 and the usage of it. Once again, there are required times that PRO1 must be utilized, but there's also, there's other times when you are meeting or need to make sure that information is captured in a document for the parents. That is also the time to use that. So the IEP is also known as the PRO7. The different sections to the IEP are listed below. We will go through those as part of today's training. So I'm not going to read those necessarily to you right now. The IEP cover page, big things to keep in mind here is make sure that the dates are accurate and the information is correct. This information is often transferred over to EMIS, and a lot of errors, I guess, occur because dates and things are not matched up on the front of the IEP document. They're typically pulled directly from it and they don't match up. If there's an instance where a date is entered incorrectly and you have to change it and on the cover page, just initial, so it doesn't look like somebody was trying to change the date or backdate it for any other purposes. But then on the document that's held in the cumulative folder should really be cleaned up and have the accurate dates. The meeting date and the meeting type, the timelines of that IEP, any other information that might be relevant is also placed in that box. Preschool outcome summary, post-secondary transition plan amendments, and just keep in mind that community schools for the purposes of the cover page are considered the district of residence for that student. Any question about the cover page? In that other information box, keep in mind when you're describing recovery services, you can state that in that box there due to coronavirus related ordered school building closure period. If you're still dealing with recovery services, please enter that information there so that is explicitly stated. And keep in mind that recovery services are not extended school year services. That they are different. Very different. Section 1. Any questions there before we move on to section 1? All right, section 1, that future planning section. If you've ever had the privilege of being under an on-site review by the Department of Education, this is not necessarily a compliance component that they are looking at and marking to be compliant or non-compliant. However, it is a requirement in the federal regulations. So don't leave this box blank. There are many instances we see where these boxes are left blank. Please avoid doing that. The main intentions of this assist in this planning the student's future. It needs to be based on discussion with the student if that's possible, and the family or the guardian, or in some instances, surrogate parents that might be involved. Just make sure there's a statement from them of some sort. Summarizes some of the students' skills and interests, their long-term goals, and once again, keep in mind that is a required component. Any questions about future planning?
If we do not have, if we have not had a chance to, due to incarceration or attendance or whatever, have the opportunity to interview with the student and the parent does not respond, can we put in there, attempted to contact parent, did not respond, therefore no updated skills or interest are available, but we are going to continue with the information that we had prior to this?
Yeah, yep, that's
Okay.
appropriate. If you've reached out to the parent and haven't gotten a response, and there's only so much you can do. Sometimes that information is discussed at the IEP meeting, which isn't, if you can't get a hold of the parent prior to the meeting, but can at the meeting, and you can add that information in there, then that is also appropriate as well.
Yeah,
But
add it at any time we get it, but I'm just saying if they don't show up and we've not got it. So that's what I've been doing, but I know somebody else was going to say something. I'm sorry if I interrupted.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say, make sure that you also document that in the PRO1, your attempts to contact the family or to contact the student with no response.
Special instructional factors. For this section, this must be addressed in the IEP. Please do not leave this blank. We can't say that enough. Oftentimes, this is found to be a non-compliant area on reviews. If you check yes, it must be addressed somewhere in the IEP. Keep in mind that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a goal or manifest itself in a behavior plan or things like that. It just needs to be addressed in the IEP. If it's clicked, if you check yes, and the team has decided not to prioritize that need right now, then a statement in the other information section should be made that needs are being prioritized, so that way if somebody looks at this document and sees yes, and they don't see a goal or a behavior plan attached or some sort of specially designed instruction, accommodation, et cetera, there's at least the safety net that you have addressed it, but the team has agreed not to prioritize it at the current time. Keep in mind, this must be based on the child's individual needs as agreed upon by the team. Any questions with instructional factors?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
If you said if you check yes, but you decide that you do not want to address, the team does not think it needs to be addressed, where do you document that?
In the other information section.
Oh, so on the cover page?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, as long as that is included there.
So it doesn't have to be in the profile, Stephen?
Or the profile is fine.
Either
That's
place?
fine
Okay,
too.
thank you.
Yep, profile or other information. There's a question. When do you mark behavior? If a student only has executive functioning goal, do we mark this, or do we mark this when it is serious behavior and impeding learning? The answer to that is if the team agrees that this is something that needs to be addressed and that behavior is a concern. There's really no like severity of behavior that we can say makes it appropriate to then add that, check that box, yes. All right, the profile. So keep in mind, the profile provides a big picture of the child. Do not copy and paste from the ETR to this section. That is a big no-no in the eyes of ODE. Summarize that information. You don't need to include, BASC scores and WISC scores and charts and pie graphs, and that information is not necessary to be put in that section. This is just going to be your summary. Big important thing here is to include the strengths of the child as well as areas for improvement. Includes background information, concerns of the parents, child's interests, medical and safety information. We get a lot of questions about, do we include medication and other diagnoses in this spot. We advise that if the medication is being something that is administered at school, or something that the school needs to know about, like an allergy or an EpiPen situation or something like that, that is appropriate. But if the kid, if the kid takes a medicine at home for something that doesn't really impact them in the school environment, it's not absolutely necessary to include that. Included in this section are the results of the most recent ETR that are not necessary, that may not be addressed in the IEP based upon the prioritization of needs. So that is kind of what I just said previously. The profile can be that kind of catch-all section if you are ever in doubt of where to put some of that additional information that is still relevant to that student.
Steve, I have a question.
Yes.
Have you heard anything from OEC about bolding, like background interest, parent concerns, previous interventions, barriers?
As you mean, like making like subheadings?
Yes.
I having my previous experience having worked there, it does make it easier when going through documents as far as like compliance checks. It's not a like must do situation.
Okay.
We've heard some feedback from districts that it does help make sure that all required components are included, especially with some of our newer teachers who are learning to sift through the document and ensuring that they're including all those components. But it is not a requirement to create subheadings. It just kind of cleans the document up a little bit and helps with organization.
Thank you. I was in a previous district where we were audited and they were telling us, don't highlight, don't bold, that makes it look like a coloring book. So I was confused with this new guidance.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I don't even know if you can highlight within the IEP program software. I've never used that feature, but I would say use it sparingly so it doesn't look like a huge like marked up document, but
Yeah,
it might
I
get
wouldn't in general as well use a highlighting feature. The only time I've really ever seen that used regularly is to remind yourself if there was an area that was missing, like parent concerns that you may put here in this profile section to draw your eye back to fix it. But when you clean it or finish it out, complete it. I would definitely not leave the highlighting. A lot of that comes down to like that printing issue. If on a black and white printer, now it has the potential to block out letters and words to make it unreadable.
Yeah, I was just surprised OEC was coming out with the guidance of bolding things, since I had heard that previously. So thank you.
Any other questions?
I
Ray?
just want to clarify, no bolding?
No, you can use, your district might tell you that they want you to bold things, and it's not like a required component. You won't get like a non-compliance finding because certain things aren't bolded.
Okay,
Um,
all right. All right, thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure.
Yep, there was a comment in the box from someone that it does help streamline what processes needed. Some districts use that when they create their own templates, so that might be helpful. And then another suggestion in the box, sometimes when amending the IEP, it's helpful to see highlighted section as the amendment. So that would be a good use of that highlight there. IQ and disability category in the IEP, there's no real like once again, no non-compliant or compliant requirement around including those things. I would just be cautious about including those things based on who can get their hands on some of these documents. If I think if the IEP is constructed the way it's intended to be constructed and the information in there is sufficient, that that information kind of doesn't become relevant in the conversation of what the IEP is. Personally, however, if there is a situation where you feel that's necessary or you're being instructed to by your district leadership to include that information, I'm not going to tell you that it's wrong or that you can't do that. That's kind of another one of those local operating procedures that some districts ask to be included and others, it's not really information needed at that time. Also, you to include in that profile, you can include information from progress reports, the performance on district and statewide assessments, and response to classroom-based interventions if not, if that's not included in that present level of performance section of the goal. Instructional strategies that are successful, or if there's other concerns, you know, maybe some of the behavior students might have you know, certain things that help them calm down or diffuse the situation, or on the other end of it, things that might instigate and throw gas on the fire. Those are also things that can be added in there for other school personnel, or if that student moves districts, that can help them. And also, if there's a reading improvement and monitoring plan, that information, some brief information summarizing that should be included in the profile as well. Section 4, the extended school year services. The biggest things here are to keep in mind that once again, this is a team decision. If you're holding a meeting, say in the fall or early winter, it's probably in the best interest of the district to then revisit the need for extended school year services later on in the spring. If you are going to do that and you have a date to reconvene, you enter it into that box. Just make sure that there is some sort of data keeping and tracking on that so that you are in fact reconvening in the spring to address that. Keep in mind that extended school year services is focused around regression and recoupment for that individual student. This is going to be typically a smaller population of students that are going to qualify. It is a individualized team decision. Are there any questions around extended school year services? No, I want to go back. There was a question, should discipline information be added if in the profile, if it is relevant to behavioral needs? Yes, just be sensitive to certain things about that student. I mean, if the student's, you know, been incarcerated, things like that, just I would just caution on being sensitive to those things. If there are like concerns around safety or social well-being in the school environment, those are definitely things that need to be added into that section, you know, just out of thought that if a student transfers schools tomorrow, they might need, that might be information that they need to know. Any questions there with ESY?
Hey, Steve, before you go on, we're getting several questions about when you do an amendment, what you put on the cover page. And I want to make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly that people are asking about the date on an amendment. The meeting date, are you referring to meeting dates or effective dates or IEP, or the next time you must convene date? Because there's 4 dates on the cover of an IEP. So well, there's actually like 6 or 7, but the actual physical meeting date is what we're talking about, or the date to reconvene? Kim, if you want to unmute and kind of pop in, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. If you don't mind, please.
Hi, this is Jake Guthrie. I'm one of Kim's coordinators in Worthington Schools.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so specifically, so we just transitioned to same goal this year. I know that's used by a lot of districts in the state, and we were told, because the document is always it's not a new document when you amend it. It's kind of just a rolling document but they said the meeting date doesn't change. Otherwise, it throws up an EMIS error when you do that. So even though you're having the amendment on a specific date, that it still stays with the annual review, but you check the annual review and the amendment box, which seems off to me. That's why we asked.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'm wondering if that's something with EMIS. Having just come from a district who used same goal, we always changed our meeting date to the date of the physical meeting, and it never threw up an EMIS error for those. That's why I was asking that question. I don't have access into same goal now, but I know the training I had was different. But I don't use, a lot of you guys go through Meta, and I didn't. I went through Mabeka. So I wonder if part of that as well could be how those trainings are set up. I think that's why when I made that initial response that it could be a program issue.
Yeah, and what Andrea is saying, so it sounds like Andrea, one of the other people in the chat, saying that's correct. The amendment date's at the bottom of the amendment section. So you date any amended sections there, and then you have it on the signature page as well. But the meeting date would still continue to be the annual review. And then Andrea, could you say, does the amendment and annual review box stay checked on the cover page as well?
Andrea, did you hear that question? I don't know if Andrea stepped away. Jamie also put, it looks like, a link to some information about it looks like state-specific guide to the amendment. And Andrea said yes in the chat box.
You need it answered for same goal.
Yeah, and that may be, and if somebody else wants to pipe in, and like I said, I'm not in same goal this year with my new role, but last year we didn't have the choice. Annual review went away and it was only amendment. So that may be an update to something with same goal, or like I said, the difference between the ITC providers. So I really would, double check, follow whatever, I guess, your ITC provider is going to tell you how to use same goal, and make sure and work with your EMIS coordinator for those.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that we wouldn't, if we're having the amendment, that we're properly documenting that date as well. So, and we would never be dinged for not.
We haven't had any errors come back by just not changing any of the dates as far as meeting or start or end dates. We just put the amended date at the bottom. And then when you go into the document, you can never unlock it. You have to go to the lock tab and then click amend. And then if there's anything that would change for your EMIS reporting, like LRE or anything like that, you actually have to change those parts of the amended IEP and then check your EMIS sheet, because it should all match what you're trying to change in your amendment. But we don't change any of the dates.
That makes sense. Do you change, and then you just change the dates in section 7 if there's something that's start dated or end dated?
I would change the start date in section 7 based on your amendment, but I would not change your end date, because your end date will not change.
unless you end dated that service for the amendment.
Correct.
So,
Like if you
Correct.
ended like a related service.
Correct.
okay, I think that clears it up. Thank you so much.
And so for those of you kind of looking at your different programs, all of your programs, I use Dazzle, the Student Information Systems and Special Services prior to same goal. So yes, you just have to find wherever your help section is on those for those individual pieces. And then I know we had a big conversation about prior writtens and the ETR. That's just where you also cover yourself as well. Make sure you document clearly in your prior written notices the dates you amended, when everybody agreed, and when those services are going to start and or end if you were having to, drop a service such as a related service.
Thank you, Kim and Jamie and everyone that chimed in on that one. That was some information I definitely so far removed from, don't even know about. So that helps. Is there any other questions there? All right, section 5 is going to be that post-secondary transition piece. Ohio does require that if the student turns 14 during the life of that IEP and thereafter, that a transition plan is constructed for that student. Federal law will say 14 or 16, I'm sorry. So there might be transfers in where a student might be in that 14 range, come from out of state, and there's no transition plan in place. You are still required, once again, if they turn 14 during the life of that IEP or anytime thereafter. Additionally, that law does require the employment goal be related to employment in a competitive, integrated environment, regardless of their disability. So that part of the law just basically protects students from being placed in, sheltered workshops or working jobs at sub minimum wage type positions. When the transition plan does apply to that student back there on that cover page, you would then mark the box yes for the student under for transition plan. There's also a box there listed that if the student is younger than 14, which like I said is the requirement, but a transition plan has been decided to be enacted based on the IEP team's decision, there's also a box that you would check there showing that that student is less than 14 but does have a transition plan in place. Keep in mind, if that transition plan is put in place for that student, even if they are younger than 14, you will still be held to all compliance and service delivery that you as the district have entered into that document as well. So just even if they're not 14, you're still required to adhere to what is written into that plan. This is the Indicator 13 checklist. This is what's used directly by the Department of Education, as well as internal monitoring teams that are set up in districts to review that transition plan. And the Indicator 13 part, for those that aren't familiar with special education profiles, is the indicator that does basically just hold the districts accountable for making sure that a transition plan is in place for students upon turning 14. This checklist is great. Like I said, internal monitoring purposes, if you're a special ed director and you're reviewing documents, or if you're a transition lead or whatever that may be, this is going to have some good guiding questions around those certain components and domains within the transition plan to make sure you're adhering to compliance. Just keep in mind, as if ODE were to come in and review the transition plans, they would use this form. If any one of the areas that I'm moving my mouse over, I'm hoping you can see, are marked as a no, then the entire transition plan is considered to be non-compliant. So it's kind of a all for one section there. There are 24 total components. So if those components are all compliant, then the whole transition plan is compliant. If just one of those 24 is found to be non-compliant, then the transition plan will be marked not as non-compliant. This indicator 13 checklist can be found on the SST website under special education resources, and it's also in the monitoring guide. If you try to get to that monitoring guide, currently there seems to be an issue with the link, but I did notify ODE and they're working to get that back up for you so that you have access to those documents. Are there any questions around the indicator 13 checklist? Or how to use that, what it's beneficial for, who should be using it? In the ideal world, I would say that anybody writing a transition plan has this document at their fingertips so that they are able to make sure all components are included, as well as work off of what the guiding questions are that ODE has provided. Another component of the post-secondary transition plan, like we said, begins at 14 or younger if determined by the IEP team. That student must be invited. That is not a should, could, would benefit from, that is a must. This is often a component of on-site reviews and compliance checks that is found to be non-compliant. The easiest way to do that is to notify the parents. When you're notifying the parents via the invitation, to click the box that says the student, and that would cover you there, and then also to put that into the PRO1 that the student was invited is also just another safety net for you. You must also notify the parents within that invitation the purpose of the meeting, that the child has been invited, and if there's any other outside agency that is going to be attending the meeting. Don't forget that if somebody from an outside agency is invited, that the parent must give consent prior to the meeting that that person will be attending. And that's going to be like your OOD, outside counseling agencies, project search people, whatever job, job coaches, things like that, that the student might have.
Even, say that again, what exactly, they have to have permission, or you just have to give a PRO1 letting them know?
The parent needs to be given permission prior to the meeting. So the best place to put that is on the IEP invitation. There's a section that'll say other. It's going to have all the required team component, all the required team members. And then there's going to be boxes that are going to include other. Other is one of those boxes, and you would just indicate it on that line. And by the parent signing that invitation, you have then provided
Okay,
the opportunity for them to consent to that person.
all right.
And then that would then go on the back end into the PRO1 saying that, so-and-so was invited to the meeting with parent consent given on this date or that date. Moving on in the transition, section 5, the transition plan, the measurable post-secondary goals must include education and training, competitive integrated employment, and then if the data supports it and the team determines it to be a need, independent living. Education and training and competitive integrated employment you must do those at minimum. Those have to be completed in their entirety and filled out, individualized to that student's needs. And if the team decides and data supports a need for an independent living goal, that must also be included. If the team decides that independent living is not going to be prioritized as a goal, then a statement needs to be put into the box down here that says the team agrees that independent living goal will not be addressed at this time. Do not leave the box blank. Once again, during a compliance check, if that box is blank, it is just presumed to be non-compliant. Kim asked a question. Kim Marani asked a question, can sections be combined? Kim, can you clarify what you mean by that?
So if with post-secondary training, education, and competitive employment, can those be combined into one if they're kind of related to each other?
One goal, one service,
So
one.
basically, post-secondary training education would be a goal, and you would combine that with employment. So you would only have it in one section of that.
No, it needs to be written in both sections. The goal might be the same, and that's appropriate and fine in my opinion. If those goals should parallel each other in some world. The service is where it's going to differ. So your service for the two goals shouldn't be, even if the goals are similar, the service for each one has to be different. But yeah, you can't like combine it in the sense of not putting the information into the second box or to the first one. Those two boxes must be filled out in their entirety at minimum.
Hi, I have a quick question. So back in the day, I remember being told that if you said that an independent living goal was not needed, it needed to be explained in the IEP why. Is that something that still needs to be in there for compliance, or was that possibly just best practice?
I will tell you, I had that question come up last year, and so I met with my legal counsel about that. Your legal
Mhm.
counsel may give you different advice, but
Mhm.
unless they're already living 100% independently, there should always be some kind of independent living goal that you would want them to move toward. Maybe it's working on a budget, or researching taxes, or like purchasing a car. What would the interest
Mhm.
rate look like on that? So unless they're already 100% independent, living by themselves, paying their own rent or mortgage, owning their own vehicles, there should always be something we should think about what they need to make sure they have those skills.
Okay, excellent. And one more, going back to the future planning, I remember being told that it was not compliant to say the team wants or the team is looking for. Is that still the case?
The future planning should all be about what it is that the student is
Mhm.
wanting for their future, not
Okay.
necessarily what the school team is wanting.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
just
So
checking. Thank
yeah,
you.
you would want to identify what the student and or parent want in there. And then if, I know somebody asked the question, what if you can't get that information? You put that statement in there that you could not contact them despite numerous attempts, or however you want to word that in that box.
Thank you.
And you can also include in that section what the IEP team, if the IEP team, if the wishes for that student are that the student completes their required graduation pathway and graduates with their cohort, or you're not necessarily, you're not going to be tied into anything if that doesn't happen. This is more just ensuring that input is gathered from all involved parties. Or the IEP team wants to see the student focus on their reaction to when given adult directives, whatever it may be. And if you do put that in that section, then just make sure it is addressed in some capacity within the document.
I would also encourage anyone that wants more in-depth transition training. We do offer a tier 2 transition training through the SST-11 that I would suggest logging into. We go a little more in depth than kind of what this meeting's about.
All right. Keep in mind that there has to be age appropriate transition assessment that indicates that students' preference, interests, needs, and strengths. There is a AATA library that is available with links that we have provided in this document that we can go to at the end. And if, like I said, like Aaron said, there is post-secondary transition training. I believe it's the 21st, maybe. I believe it's the 21st. So if you want to get further information, we do go a little bit into the AATA library and different materials and questions around that. For the purposes of this training, just keep in mind that it must be relevant to what that student, don't give a high school student an AATA that's designed for 5th graders, and don't give, and vice versa. Just make sure it's going to help yield that information to best construct what that student's preferences, interests, needs, and strengths are. The course of study in this section needs to either say that the student is participating in the Common Core curriculum, or they are participating in the extended standards, or if there's a CTC program, career tech programming that student might be participating in, that just needs to be explicitly stated in this section. There should never be an instance where they are participating in the general curriculum and the alternate extended standards. Just as you guys know, you can't really mix and match those things as far as it goes for a student. If that student is a student that does participate in the extended standards and learning progressions are involved, that never hurts to include that information there as well.
Can you repeat that again?
Which part?
Just breaking it down. You have the course of study, and generally the course of study should be the Common Core unless you're a CTC. But then you said they should never include extended. So I'm sorry, go ahead. That's what I'm saying.
They should never be
repeat
on
that.
extended standards and general curriculum standards.
It's one or the other is what you're saying.
Right. You can't
Okay,
be like
yeah,
that.
all right.
You
All
can't
right, got it.
qualify as a student with a significant cognitive disability, like let's say in math and not in reading.
I just misheard you. Thank you.
No problem. Also, the annual goal section, there should be an annual goal. This part's kind of a gimme as far as compliance goes. If there's an annual goal, all of your annual goals really should help transitioning that student to post-secondary life. And then transition service and activity. Make sure that that service and activity is what the school district and or other could be an outside agency are providing for that student. It has to be adult behavior, not what that student is going to be doing. This is often a part we get a lot of questions. I encourage you, like Erin said, if you have questions about a lot of these little nuanced things, please attend our training next week or reach out and we can kind of help walk you through that. But there are often a lot of questions around services. And then at the bottom is the target date to graduate. When you enter that information there, keep in mind, life happens, things happen. If that student, if you enter 2024 and the student ends up having to defer graduation, it's not something that you'll be held liable for not happening, or things like that. Keep in mind that when you're completing transition services as well, that there is some sort of documentation or completion showing that activity has been completed, some data or documentation that if you were asked, you can answer to that service have been completed and provided to that student. Moving into some age-appropriate transition assessment guidance. Keep in mind this part must include preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. We often see, we had that conversation a little bit earlier about subheadings and boldings. Some IEP programs have been pre-populated by district level admin with the preferences, interests, needs, and strengths, just to make sure that those are all included in that section. Just be as explicit as you can based on that age-appropriate transition assessment, what those preferences, interests, needs, and strengths are of that student. If it's a student whose AATA says that they enjoy helping other people, working in groups, in teams, and then their goal is like maybe around sitting behind a computer or like a solo isolated job, you might be questioned on why the AATA isn't matching what the services and the goals are for that student. Just make sure that based on that age appropriate transition assessment, you are developing meaningful goals and services given the information provided. Any questions with the AATA? As far as documentation, make sure you list the type of assessments that you've conducted, the person or agency conducting that assessment, and the dates in which the assessments took place. Summarize the results. We don't, once again, it's not necessary to include charts and scores and things like that. This is merely a summary in this part that's going to help construct those meaningful services for that student. And make sure that you are considering those results. If it says that the student, might struggle receiving multiple step directions, then maybe some independent work would be harder for that student. If it says that they like cosmetology and their goal is that they're going to work and they're going to take auto tech class, that might also be something that you're questioned on just because of it doesn't coincide with what that age appropriate transition assessment is telling you. Erin, did you have anything to add to the AATA section?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I did throw into the chat box a link to the ODE transition modules. That's a really good place to start as well. It kind of outlines everything.
Okay. All right, as part of the post-secondary goal formula, as you can see here on this slide, and I'm not going to go through, just keep in mind that the post-secondary goals are stated to occur after that student leaves high school. So after high school, after graduation, upon completion of high school, the student use their name. That way, it still holds that individualization component to it. Will do what and where and how. As far as transition responsibility, schools are responsible for providing educational programs and transition services stated in the IEP. Schools are not responsible for the accomplishment of the specific post-secondary goal. So if the goal is that the student will attend a 4-year college program in I don't know, psychology, and they end up not going to school for psychology, the school is not going to be on the hook for that. The school will be on the hook, however, for the services that they've stated as what they're going to provide for that student. Here's a couple of examples of goals. As far as post-secondary training and education goes. And then the next slide is some competitive integrated employment goals. We always caution when we give out examples, just be careful how you're using our examples. There's been instances on on-site reviews where examples have been provided by state support teams or whomever, and every single transition plan had the same information in it. And at that point, they, obviously would be found to be non-compliant based on individualization for that student. So just be cautious how you use those examples or give those out to staff, teachers, colleagues, whatever it may be. Any questions there? And here's an example of a combined training and education and competitive integrated employment goal. For who I can't remember who asked that before, but here's an example. Just make sure if you are combining those that it's listed in both boxes and the services are different. Post-secondary goals need to be updated annually, just as like within the IEP, academic and behavioral goals. This does not mean they change, but they must be reviewed annually. Ways to document and update that they've been reviewed. The IEP summary notes that indicate discussion and approval for continuation of the goals. They're updated or more detailed and new information in AATA that aligns with current goals. It is, with that, you know, it's perfectly appropriate that the goal from year to year might be the same if that student's really sold on, you know, a certain career pathway or education pathway. That would be the same. What would be expected is that the services become more focused and honed in on specific skills as that student gets older and closer to reaching that goal. Course of study, college prep course for graduation, the curriculum based on Ohio learning standards. Here's again some language that you can use. Curriculum based on the Ohio learning standards extended, and career tech education programming with an identified program. So just make sure that you have at minimum one of those listed. If it is career tech, you would also have curriculum based on Ohio learning standards as well included, just to show that that student is participating in both their academics as well as their career tech programming. That transition service or activity based on the individual child's needs. That's the biggest component here, is that that is individualized based on their preferences, interests, needs, and strengths that you take away from the AATA that you administer to the student. Example of some transition services are also listed here. Once again, we caution you on using some of those overusing the examples, I guess is the best way of saying that. You can use these examples, but just make sure it's individualized and that you have data to support those decisions and services that you choose. Transition services, this is a big non-compliance component that is found in reviews, is how the service is worded. I know it gets picky when it just comes down to semantics, but just keep in mind, do not write that Sally will or provide an opportunity to. It should be written the adult behavior first. If that, we get the question, if the adult is supporting the student's work or you know, working with the student, guiding the student, facilitating the student, whatever it may be, just make sure that the intervention specialist is the role that they have or other personnel have is explicitly stated in terms of what the adults are doing, not what the student would be responsible for doing. Question in the box. I have a teacher that insists in his previous districts that he listed all activities that the student will complete over the last 4 years of high school with corresponding future dates. I've told that he is not able to do that, and only activities completed during the life of the IEP should be included. He insists he is right. Please advise. Neither are really compliance related components. It's really going to come down to what you as the supervisor deem to be appropriate at that time. I would say it is not necessarily appropriate to include information that is presumed to be taking place at a later date, just because then you are putting in writing that you're basically putting yourself on the hook for whatever those activities may be. And it's not really predetermination, but you're kind of putting some things ahead of where they need to be with projecting, I guess, what those services or activities could be. I would just advise that you keep it strictly to the life of that IEP, so you're not missing something or writing something in that you can later be held accountable for.
I would agree with you, Steve. And I think if you do things out of the scope of the IEP, you're going to have a very difficult time doing the progress report on things outside of the scope of the IEP. So you just want to make sure that whatever's in that transition section, remember you also have a transition progress report that has to be completed with progress reports as well.
Another question, when would it be acceptable to combine integrated employment and post-secondary education and training? That, again, that yeah, I feel like I'm probably wearing this answer out, but that's going to be a team decision as well. In that instance, if that's going to be probably, yeah, just not always, but could potentially be later on in the student's education where there's more of a focus on a specific career or education pathway at that point. I don't ever see, there's not really like a reason to or a reason not to do it that way. I would just caution that if you're combining or you're instructing teachers to write those goals as combined goals, that there's going to be some trip ups with some copying and pasting of services, and that could get you into a whole heap of issues as far as that goes. I don't know, Aaron or Kim, or do you guys have any like instances where you would have guided people to do it that way or guided people not to, other than the team deciding or it being like a very specific focused goal?
To me, I mean, I always went with the basis of if the AATA truly documents that students' preferences, interests, needs, and skills or services, that they could combine it if they want to, but it definitely needs to be joint. Whereas if you have students who maybe they want to not necessarily go on to post-secondary education, and they just want to do like on-site job training, that might be one where I would definitely combine the two, because the on-site job training is in that employment industry. Whereas if they're definitely going to go on to college or and maybe work part-time, doing something completely different than what maybe they're going to college for, I would then separate them out. Again, what Steve said, it just depends on what your district is, what their preference is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Kind of the only areas that we really ever saw that being combined in the districts where I worked was maybe if we had a student ending or getting closer to the end of their high school career and we're working directly with OOD trying to think about job placement, which is going to include that additional training because we're trying to get them into a point in their transition for job placement. Or we had one that was very similar when I had a student who was part of Project Search, because they were actively at that point working a job and working on those skills at Project Search. So it wasn't a regular thing that we did to combine. But once again, I will say the same thing Steve said several times. It can be that team-based decision on what's best for that kid and what does that individual child need to prepare for the future.
Yeah, moving on to transition services activities. Transition services, like recently stated, must be individualized and help the student reach their post-secondary goals identified in Section 5. Schools must be prepared to provide documentation or proof of evidence that transition services are being delivered or completed. And to help with that, there is a link to the optional progress reports form. Just a little disclaimer here, the progress report, the OP6B, the progress on the transition progress report is an optional form, but the process of reporting on progress is not. So you are still required to report on transition progress as well, but you don't necessarily have to use this form. Most people just default to this form because it does ensure that compliance is met, but this is listed as an optional form, not an optional process. So keep that in mind. Are there any questions there? With that,
Where is this OP6B found at, the one you're showing?
this is also listed on ODE's website under that optional and required forms.
No,
It should
that-
also
that-
be in your system too, whatever system you're using. I think you had mentioned, Amy, you're using student information systems through Progress Book. There should be an
Correct.
optional form there as well.
I don't know about this one. I'm not seeing this one, but I'm gonna look now, so, but thank you.
Mhm.
The number of annual goals related to transition needs. Annual goals are going kind of by default, going to support that movement towards post-secondary goals. Each section the team agrees to address must have corresponding goals and services. And once again, all must be tied and related to the needs found in that age-appropriate transition assessment. At any IEP meeting where transition is being discussed, the student must be invited regardless of age and or disability category. The student can then be included on that PRO2, which is that parent invitation form. There are instances where it might not be appropriate to have that student participate in the entire meeting. We get that question all the time. Can the student just come for the part around transition? That's going to have to be, once again, that's going to have to be your best guidance as either the district rep or the person responsible for that meeting. If that student, can sit through the whole meeting. Sometimes those meetings are triggers for students, so it might not be appropriate for the entire time, but in the time where that student is, that transition is being discussed, just make sure that student is given the opportunity through the invitation to participate. In some instances, parents might say, I don't want the student to come down here, or whatever that may be. So it's kind of individualized at that point.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is the student has to be invited. There are sometimes students will say, I don't want to miss class. And so then hopefully your intervention specialist has already spoken to the student to get their input going into those. There could be another piece of a trigger type piece as well. A parent could say no, that they don't want them there, but remind them that we are obligated to do so. As far as documenting that you've invited them, I know the practice that I always followed is we gave the students, sometimes we had them sign on the same invitation as their parent, but we always gathered a student signature, just like we did a parent signature. So that way we always had that documentation if it ever got questioned that we invited the student. So that was just a practice that we did.
Is it all right just to send those out email to the student?
You can. I mean, it has to be. I would always send an invitation to the last known address on file. If the parent does have email,
right,
you
well,
can correspond appropriately that way. But you also have, you have to document multiple attempts and multiple means.
The student should also get a PRO2, not just an email saying, hey, we're having your meeting on this day. They should also be getting that PRO2 on that parent invitation form.
Right, but I'm just saying, I know I've got the parent invitation. So if I've got that, is it done? Or should I, my question then becomes, and usually as long as I have the interview and I'm seeing the student, then I have everything that I need. But there are the rare occasions where the student is, not truant, but just doesn't come enough, has, a lot of absences, those kinds of things. So if I'm not seeing them, to send out an email, would that be appropriate, or should I just still follow the same process?
It would be best practice. It would be kind of excessive and get pretty tedious to make sure you're including students with official invites. The only requirement is that the student's name is the student at minimum is included on the invite that is sent to the parent.
Okay, that's all. All right, that's all I needed. Thank you.
You're not required to send a separate invitation to the parents.
Okay, that's what I was making sure. Thank you.
Just a good resource as far as transition information. They do modules, they have speaking engagements, conferences, things like that, as well as articles and other resources is NTACT, the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition. Encourage you, if you are somebody who is looking for more information, resources, to visit that site and get that information. They also have a newsletter if you sign up on their website that they'll send you they send monthly, maybe a couple times a month, just different like blogs and snippets and opportunities and grant opportunities. There's all kinds of different things around related to transition. So it is a good resource for people. Here are the links. Like I said, this first one is going to be to that age appropriate transition assessment library. This has all been vetted through state support teams and ODE. So anything on there would be appropriate to use. Also included on this link sheet is OOD, DODD, and then ODE's website, which also has transition related material on it as well. All right, we've been at it for about an hour and 15 minutes. Why don't we go ahead and take like a 10-minute break here? We can come back at about 2:30 to 2:29, 2:30, and we'll go ahead and get started on the rest of the document. So if you want to take a quick break, and we will see you back in about 10 minutes. All right. Moving into measurable annual goals. Just remember in the present level, just remember first and foremost, these goals should always be prioritized. It's really hard and almost impossible to understand how a document could have 26 goals. That I say 26 because I actually reviewed an IEP at one point that had 26 goals. I don't know how those goals can all adequately be addressed by teachers and then even on the backside monitored appropriately for documenting progress, but prioritize the goals. If it is a really involved student that has multiple goals, prioritize those goals as a team and address those goals. But also if there are goals that are not being addressed or concerns, just include that in the profile that the team has agreed to prioritize 5 goals for this upcoming semester, year, whatever it may be, the lifetime of the IEP, and just keep that in mind. In the present level of academic and functional performance, make sure you're establishing that baseline of the student's current classroom performance that documents what the child is able to do compared to their typical peers. Make sure that that present level of performance also coincides with what the goal is. Don't write, a present level of performance about student can identify letter sound correspondence for 20 of the 26 letters and then write a goal based on comprehension. Everybody knows that kind of that progression towards comprehension is being the end goal. If they don't understand letter sound correspondence, comprehension is going to be virtually impossible unless they're either a really good guesser or have some sort of auditory skill that would supersede those not understanding that letter sound correspondence. But make sure those goals match up. Make sure that the goal is that the present level performance is related to the goal area. Don't write what the student's doing in reading class for a math goal, vice versa, things like that. If you are including a behavior goal, present level of performance, if the behavior goal is that the student will follow teacher directives, make sure that there is present level of performance that supports that data. Don't just put things in there like the student has been written up 6 times this year, or that doesn't really give enough information that coincides with that present level of performance to write a meaningful goal. The typical peer statement, we get asked the question sometimes, can we just write the learning standard in there? That would be kind of once again a local decision if that is how the district has agreed or been guided by their legal counsel to indicate what the typical peer would be doing, then that would be appropriate in that instance. Any questions with present level of performance? Just make sure it is current. Past date, if the student's in 6th grade, data from 2nd, 3rd grade, 4th grade really isn't relevant to you at that time. So just make sure it is current as guidance from ODE on current is anything within the last year. More information on present levels of performance, achievement, and functional performance related to that. Baseline data, describe it in measurable terms of growth that will link directly to that goal. A detailed summary of their daily academic, behavior, or functional performance, also including information regarding the skills of the child and how does the disability affect that child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum in relation to their peers. Also in this section, it is appropriate to include interventions that have been used for the child, whether they're effective or not effective for that student, and then assessment data if applicable. Elements of a measurable goal: a clearly defined behavior, condition under which the behavior will occur, and the criteria used to evaluate the performance. In the past, there's been some varying guidance. At one point, there were 6 components, and then there was 3 components. Within these 3 components now that we are listing and advising districts to use are those 6 previous components. They've just kind of synthesized it a little bit better to help in understanding. As far as the clearly defined behavior, make sure that it's clear and concise, specific action the student will be expected to perform. About one skill, there should only be one skill. I can't reiterate that enough. Oftentimes we get goals that Johnny will, add, subtract, multiply, and divide, choose the function, apply the function to the problem, and determine the correct outcome. That's too many skills all bunched into one goal. Do not blend those skills such as decoding and fluency into one goal. If there is a decoding and fluency need, they should be listed as two specific goals, clearly defined specific goals. The condition under which the behavior will occur, the condition will be defined as the situation, setting, or given material in which the behavior is to be performed. And the third component is the criteria used to evaluate performance. The level the student must demonstrate for mastery, the number of times the skill or behavior must be demonstrated, and the same unit of measurement or criteria that is used with the data in the present level of performance. And then make sure you avoid vague terms. The biggest thing with making sure that the unit of measurement in the plop is the same is you get into, if the plop says, 75%, they do a skill at 75%, and you're now saying that they need to do it 2 out of 3 times, you get kind of confusing there. And then also then, averages and different things come into play. At the bottom part of every goal, this is often something that is, if every one of these boxes is checked, then ODE would expect to see documentation of evidence in every single one of those boxes. There needs to be at minimum something checked there. But if you check all of them, just understand that you will be held as far as compliance to providing documentation of evidence in every single one of those areas. That often gets districts tripped up once they get to formal complaints with ODE, and ODE sees all of those checked. They're going to want to see evidence that the district can provide showing that, curriculum-based assessment, portfolios, observation, so on and so forth are, there is hard documentation for that. Here's the 6 conditions for developing the measurable goals, like just so you can see it. Kind of all the inclusive things that are built into those 3 components. Under what conditions, who obviously is the child, will do what, to what level or degree, and what length of time, and how will progress be measured. For the length of time, keep in mind there that is the time for you to complete the goal or the objectives, don't offer ranges in this section. And then for the progress being measured, select method or methods from the list on the IEP form. Just make sure you're not getting carried away and putting a lot of those options and that you're not able to answer to. This is often something you see a lot. I don't know if students just aren't learning this in college, but a lot of newer IEP teachers, intervention specialists, people writing IEPs think that they have to have all of those boxes checked, and that is not necessarily appropriate. However, there does need to be some method, 1 or 2 at minimum listed. Are there any questions there?
Going back to under the criteria, and you said it was something in relation to the percentage and then the way to measure it. So if you write the plop, the present level is done in percentage, then you're saying the criteria should be measured in percentage also? Or
I'm just saying, make sure that, like, if you put 2 out of 3 times, but the baseline data says 75%, it's going to be hard to measure 2 out of 3 times to get to 75%.
right, so just make sure if you do like 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4, it should measure up to be able to measure up to the goal that you have intended.
Yeah, the condition, the condition, to what level or degree should match what the present level of performance is.
Right, 3 out of 4 is 75% versus, okay, that's what you mean, like that?
Right. Yep.
Okay.
To what level or degree? There's 2 parts to this: the level of mastery, percentage of accuracy, number of times or percent of time or duration, the number of times and the number of times a student. You must see that the skill or behavior that shows the level of mastery for that student. Baseline data example: currently, when given a beginning 3rd grade reading passage, Paul is able to accurately read the selection at an average rate of 20 words per minute. This also brings up a point when if you're giving baseline data at a 3rd grade reading passage, make sure that the goal, you are expecting the goal to be met at that same 3rd grade reading level. If you are expecting it at a different level or at the student's independent level or whatever that may be, you need to explicitly state that. If it is not the same as it's presumed that it's the same level that the student is in, the same grade level the student is in, unless otherwise marked. Here are some examples of goals. Once again, caution you in using these goals. These are just used as far as creating an outline for you, but not necessarily saying if the student needs a reading goal, come to this document and use this goal for that student. As you can see, the objectives are going to be those smaller skills that are addressed that will help that student reach that overall mastery as listed in the goal. As this one is written, objective 1 is 40, objective 2 is 60, and objective 3 is then 80. But the time in which they're doing it and the conditions to which they're doing it is all the same. It is just showing those stair-stepping skills that will enable that student to reach that rate of 100 words per minute. Here's another writing goal, and you guys can go through these. We're not going to read through those. Progress monitoring, I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself. If you go on to ODE's website and pull up this document, there are some like hover bubbles or whatever you want to call it, that if you hover over one of these, like performance assessment, that's what this example is. If you hover over performance assessment, it will give you a definition of what would be expected to be seen by ODE as far as that performance assessment goes. So that is a good resource as well for teachers if they're unsure of what any of these might be, what their expectation would be. And then the frequency at which the progress is reported on is listed down at the bottom, reported every X amount of weeks. Keep in mind, you are required to report on progress at minimum when the general ed population is also having their progress reported on. So typically that's around report card times. That may vary by district. Might be 9 weeks, it might be 12 weeks, it might be whatever it is. If students are given interims, that is also something to consider when reporting progress for all students. If there is a need and the IEP team decides that there's a need to report on progress maybe more frequently, you are also able to write that in as the team agrees and comes to that decision.
Steve, we've got a couple questions here. Jill, when he showed the examples, did that help answer your question about the baseline data for goals and objectives?
It looked like the baseline only had one thing stated in it. Does that mean, is that sufficient?
So if you write goals that encompass multiple things, then you need to have separate goals. So this
Right.
one would only be talking about his fluency rate for this example with Paul.
So this would be for the objective, or this would be for the goal? And then
Correct.
what would the objectives be for that? Would they,
That would be dependent upon what this example student Paul would need to reach that goal. So currently he's reading 20 words per minute. So that's what you're basing that on. What is your goal going to be? Is it going to be 40 words per minute? And then your objectives would break that down into how is he going to learn that goal?
okay. But would we need, so I agree that this is baseline data for that goal, but then once you've determined what the objectives are, do you need to have baseline data for those objectives as well?
No, because this baseline data is for your goal and your objectives are how you're going to reach that goal.
Okay.
And then Erica, you asked, if you choose benchmarks. So benchmarks are more time bound even so than objectives. We kind of talk about those a little bit more of like those stepping stones. So they might be, in the first 9 weeks of a year, this is going to happen. And you keep kind of upping the ante a little bit versus the objectives, which could last more of that duration of the IEP.
Okay, so our objectives, should we kind of go with those more so than benchmarks? Or is there a time when you use one or the other more frequently or better?
If you think about this one, I'll use this kind of as an example. If 20 words per minute is what his baseline data was, and let's say we're going to be 100 words per minute in a year from now, our benchmark may be that by the end of, we'll just say this IEP started at the beginning of a school year right at the beginning, just for ease. By the end of the first 9 weeks, they might be at 30 words per minute. And then maybe the next benchmark could be 50 words per minute. So that's how they're going to keep building on each other. So I wouldn't say that there's a right or wrong for any and every situation. You just really need to think about how are they going to get there.
Okay, and even if we did that, we still don't have to put like a specific date. So same goal offers you to put like, when you're doing this, on the side where you would put like by 9/15/2022, this is going to happen. And then you would put another date like by 11/18/2022. You see what I mean? Do we have to do that part of it? Like, is that part mandated? If you do,
yes. So even in your benchmarks or your goals, or I'm sorry, benchmarks or objectives, they should still be time bound. So your objectives may just say by the end of this IEP, where your goal may say, your objective may say by the end of the IEP, your benchmark may say by the end of the first 9 weeks, or you could put a specific date, or you could do second 9 weeks, or however you choose to monitor those in the benchmarks.
Okay, so
they're going to be shorter intervals of time.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Can I also ask a follow-up on the baseline? So if we're looking at something and we have a really generic example of the student's got a goal about reading comprehension questions and their baseline is 68% or something like that. And the objectives focus on literal questions, and then there's an inferential questions, and then there's one about evaluative questions. Would we need baseline for each of those different types of comprehension questions, or just overall comprehension questions?
I believe, and Aaron or Steve, feel free to jump in here. That's going to depend on what did you use for your baseline data and what did it evaluate? Did it break those down into those areas of that when it was assessing that student's knowledge?
That's what the question was, though. Like, if I just do my baseline, like this baseline example here just says that he's accurately reading at 20 words per minute. So if I say he can answer comprehension questions at 68% accuracy, would that cover all of those different pieces? Or do I need to break down the baseline to focus on each of those different types of comprehension questions?
I would suggest that you would break down the baseline, because he may be 68% overall, but maybe he's 40% in inferential and 70% in those literal questions.
That's what I thought. I just was not quite getting that from what you had said before. I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Yep. I also see a question on there. Should an IEP be updated whenever they reach a goal? Whenever a student has mastered a goal, yes, you should amend their IEP and write a new goal. That doesn't necessarily mean if they've mastered a benchmark or an objective leading to that goal. But if they have mastered a goal, you absolutely must be amending the IEP and writing a new goal.
You still amend it even if you have other goals that you're working on and may not have time to do any more on the one that they mastered because you're working on the others?
Yes, because they already had an identified deficit. So that's why you have that goal, have a goal in there based off of what their ETR data was driving their goals.
Say that again.
The ETR data is what drives the goals that you have in an IEP. So if a student has an identified disability and basic reading skills, you can't just stop working on basic reading skills because they mastered the first goal. You need to now write a new goal that pushes them and continues to close that gap.
Okay.
I think we got the questions there, Steve.
Yeah, there's a comment. Will you be going back to goals? I don't know, Mr. Mensa, if you want to, if you needed clarification or just needed to see the screen again, or. All right, I'm not really sure, but we will move on. The optional form 6A is going to be your progress reporting document for your goals, your academic and functional goals. This is also, once again, an optional form. It is not an optional procedure. You are required to report on the progress that the student is making. But the form that you use is locally controlled. We always advise districts to use the forms that ODE has built into their documents and their software, just to ensure that you're including all of the required components that ODE would be looking for as far as compliance goes. Back to the question about somebody asked a question, even if there's other goals, do we still amend the IEP? And like Kim said, the answer is yes. If the student has either met the goal or is making no progress towards that goal, that is also something that needs to be addressed in the IEP team meeting. Keep in mind, when you're reporting on the progress, that there needs to be like data points included. Don't and this kind of goes back, we don't see it as much as we used to, but the simply just writing goal met, not met, minimal progress, not introduced, things like that is not sufficient in reporting on that progress for the student. Any questions? All right, section 7, description of specially designed services. How are you teaching the child and how is it different from what every child receives? That is going to be what specially designed instruction is. What is being provided for that student that is different from what every other child is receiving. Hence the specially designed instruction. Description of specially designed services. The type of service can be specially designed instruction, related services, assistive technology, accommodations, modifications, your support for school personnel, and your services to support medical needs, if applicable. Section 7, under specially designed instruction, the IEP must specify the special education services, related and other support services that are going to be needed to implement the goals and objectives appropriately. The IEP must specify the instructional grouping, whether it is a small group, one-on-one, or in the general education class, whatever that may be. Just make sure you're specifying it there. Keep in mind, if you're going to say small group, that really shouldn't be a class that has, 24 kids in it. That doesn't really, ODE doesn't define what small group is, but just keep your professional judgment in mind there. The IEP must specify the service and description of that service. IEP must specify who is providing the service, the intervention specialist, the speech therapist, etc. And the IEP may specify more than one service for one goal. Make sure each one is defined and each one has its own box there. Specially designed instruction describes the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. Again, what you're doing differently for the students to address their unique needs and to ensure access to the general curriculum. This needs to be individualized. We caution against, drop-down menus in these sections because it moves away from that individualization that the team needs to focus on for that student. The content is in what skill, and the methodology is the repeated practice, paired reading, whatever it may be. And then the delivery is the group size, the conditions, and when it will be taking place. The provider is who will be providing that, location is where, and the time and frequency is the amount of time instruction will be given towards the implementation of the goal listed and how the service will be provided. We get a lot of questions around the time and frequency. Just make sure you are explicit. Don't use terms like intended to be, or as the student chooses, or if the student wants. Things like that are some examples of what not to write. And the time and frequency is not necessarily if the time that the student is in that classroom, but just the time that that specially designed instruction is being given to that student. So if it's a 90-minute class, but only 15 minutes per day are provided, is when the specially designed instruction is provided. Don't put 90 minutes daily, because then you are on the hook for an exuberant amount of time that you will be held to and required to provide compensatory time if that number is not met and provided with evidence. Jill asked a question: if you provide small group in the gen ed classroom, such as being pulled to the back of the room, is that considered a small group? For specificity purposes of where the specially designed instruction is being provided, yes. As far as like LRE and things like that, then no. So if it's a gen ed class, like with an inclusion gen ed class, and the intervention specialist might pull, a group of 6 or 8 students to the back to provide specially designed instruction, that would be the small group, the specially designed instruction being provided in the small group. It is not necessarily class-wide, but that is a different conversation as far as LRE goes for that student.
Can you explain what you mean about the LRE?
Well, it's being provided in a general education classroom, not in a special education classroom.
Oh, okay. So the location would just have to say gen ed classroom.
The location would say be as specific as possible, a small group within the general education setting.
Okay.
Steve, I had a question too about the location of services and the guidance on the wording. Intervention classroom versus resource room versus cross cat room. I had a teacher want to use cross cat room, but then was concerned if that student then got out of that cross cat room but went into a separate resource room. Do you have any guidance on that?
I would look at the operating standards for the definition of what a cross-categorical classroom is. So then you really want to tier that into, so if you're talking about a reading goal, for example, that may be done in a cross-categorical classroom, but a behavioral goal for a student on their needs may not. that may be more of an inclusion type setting. So I would really go back to how the operating standards defines those classrooms.
Well, and what I told her, a cross-cat room is an intervention room or a resource room. She just really wanted to use cross-cat. So I didn't know if there was guidance. To me, a cross-cat room is a resource room. Everyone in there is on an IEP.
What if you don't
And
have a resource room?
Well, so a lot of it's going to depend on the services, and that's where I'm going to tell you to go back and look there, because typically speaking, a cross-categorical classroom, students are spending the majority of their day out of the gen ed setting. So that's going to come down to what their IE code is, you know, if they're an IE 13, 14, or 15. Looking at that. So you want to look at how long they're receiving those services in those different LREs.
And the question about what if we don't have a resource room, that's a pretty loaded question. You are required to provide the full continuum of services to students to ensure that their needs are being met. So there's a lot of different things that go into that. I'm not sure who asked that question, but that's probably better discussed outside of this this group, just because it is so in depth, what you're asking there. There's a couple questions. Going back to progress reports, I want to make sure I understand. Say you have a goal with 4 objectives and you provide progress on the first objective in the progress report. Since the objectives are supposed to be stepping stones to the goal, wouldn't it make sense to put that have not gotten to the other objectives in the report? Yes, you can do that there. Just don't make it like, don't get into the habit of like when the student gets their first quarter progress reports that everything says it's not been introduced, or then we would question what's going on at all. It certainly, if that specific skill has not been introduced, you know, being the end goal, as it relates to the end goal, then you can certainly mark that in. If you don't mark something, then it'll just be presumed non-compliant and left blank. Seeing transfer documents identifying more than one location, such as the gen ed and intervention room. Some also include both the gen ed teacher and intervention specialist. Just checking that it continues to be only one provider in one location. Yes, that's correct. The only instance where more than one provider can be listed is in a truly taught co-teaching classroom, not an inclusion classroom where no offense, I was a coach myself, but when the baseball coach comes in and sits in the back of the room and the gen ed teacher provides all the instruction and that person is just helping the special ed kids when they need help, that's not a truly co-taught classroom. If it is a truly co-taught classroom where there's co-planning to co-serve, then yes, more than one person can be listed in the box, but also specify in that box, in that section, that is a co-taught classroom. And then I think the question is what acceptable terminology would be for classes outside of the general education setting, i.e. direct math class. I'm not really sure if that's a question or a statement, but if Kim wants to elaborate on that.
I think every district may define special ed classrooms a little differently. Some may call them specialized learning centers, some may call them resource rooms, some may call them direct math class. So if it's in regards to a classroom only for students with disabilities receiving services in that class, whatever your district names those classes is what you would put in there.
Yeah, that's why I was asking that.
Yeah, and then I saw Barb asked a question, does small group have to be specifically defined as far as the number of students? There is no specific number. I know in past practice in my previous role as a director, if I knew a student needed to be in a group of no more than 2 or 3 because of medical needs or whatever, then that would be the only time I would ever define, but that is not a general rule practice you need to do. That really would be an IEP team decision if you specified what that small group number looks like. And that we only ever really use that on testing, in a testing setting, not the instructional setting.
Are we all caught up on questions? I want to make sure we didn't miss anybody before we move on. Okay. Specially designed instruction, a program name should not be used within this section. Instead, provide a description of what the program is designed to do. Instead of citing Orton Gillingham, for instance, use a multisensory approach to reading with an emphasis on fluency and comprehension. If you use specific names, and you're really kind of pigeonholing yourself and saying that only that program is what's going to be provided to, there are other programs besides Orton Gillingham to address reading needs. So just make sure you're including what that program is intended to do, not necessarily the brand or the name or whatever you want to call it. Examples of some specially designed instruction: small group instruction is your delivery in 4 basic math operations. That's the content, using manipulatives and multiple opportunities for practice. So you're including your delivery, your content, and your methodology. And there's another example listed there as well for you. Direct small group instruction with modeling and guided practice and using comprehension strategies, including answering why and what will happen next questions. That is very specific. That in the ideal world would be what is expected. Again, and small group instruction to develop appropriate conversation using social modeling, demonstrations, and repeated practice with peers. So as you can see, both of those are very specific to the skill that that student is expected to master based on what is written into the goal, as it relates to the data, supporting data around their baseline. If there are any differences between specially designed instruction elements, such as the type of service goal, provider, location, time, and frequency, a new set of boxes needs to be used. So don't, include all those things in one box. Also, I would caution against, just throwing a whole bunch of accommodations and modifications onto the IEP, because if it came down to it, you would then be required to provide all of them. Focus on the ones that are really going to allow the student to access that general curriculum and have the opportunity to be successful based on what instruction, especially design instruction, you will be providing them. Just simply listing every accommodation under the sun is not going to, cater to that individualization. And oftentimes the more things that are listed, the more are not being addressed, and then that becomes a serious non-compliant issue. Most of the complaints we do receive do fall around specially designed instruction section of the IEP. So keep that in mind as you are going through that. The provider, who will be providing this instruction? Only the title of the person is needed. Don't put, Miss Legault, put intervention specialist or whatever role that person is acting in. The IEP must be clear as to which service providers are providing the service. So who is providing that service? Also, the person that should be listed. This must be a licensed individual as well. So if you have like a tutor that volunteers in the school district, they cannot be written in as being responsible for providing specially designed instruction. Aid and paraprofessionals and general education teacher goes under support for school personnel, not under SDI. The intervention specialist is the person responsible for the implementation of the IEP. So the paraprofessional would go under the support for school personnel, and the implementation for the IEP would then fall under the licensed intervention specialist. That information also goes a little bit more in depth in that transcript of the universal support materials, and the direct citation is listed there if you're interested in finding out more about that. Where is the instruction being provided? If it is provided in multiple locations, such as the general ed classroom and a resource room, that is considered multiple services and needs to be listed separately. Are there any questions there? We usually get some questions here. There's a question, can we use designated intervention space? I'm not saying not to, it's just not very specific.
Well, that was, so something we kind of are encountering is when kids hop in and out of different schedules at high school, like they go from this class to that class to this class. So if perhaps, and we do hold an amendment or whatever, it is a resource to an inclusion. If we say designated intervention space, we're just trying to be, I guess, efficient. So we're not having them in several parts, or we don't get in trouble if it's happening in the gen ed room, or if we did a pull out real quick and it's not in the gen ed room. Do you see what I mean? I don't know, we're trying to CYA there.
Yeah, I understand from the teaching side why you would write that. It has to be clear so that somebody, picking up the document at ODE is going to understand what exactly you're talking about. I understand how it happens in the flow of a school day to be very different, but
I'd say also like at the preschool level, a lot of times if we're working on transitioning or social development, things like that, we do that all over the building. So outside, transitioning to different areas of the building. So in the past, I've put, preschool environment because we're working on these skills through the hallway. We're working on them everywhere. So I know that's not very specific, but that's kind of where we are. So would you say it needs to be more specific than if it's like a behavior or like an adaptive transition goal, something like that?
I don't know. Aaron or Kim, do you guys have anything? It's just you're not going to be found. Let me say this, you won't be found non-compliant by everybody who reviews records at ODE for writing that, but you may be found non-compliant for some people. It's really going to come down to, I always encourage you to be as specific as possible. Like, is this going to pass the stranger test if a new teacher comes in tomorrow and they look at that designated, I don't remember what the specific language was, designated intervention space, are they going to know what that is? Or a new school district going to know what that is? Because a designated intervention space in District A could be a resource room. In District B, it could be the stairwell or the hallway or the guidance counselor's office, or it's just not specific. That's really all I don't know if Kim or Aaron has a different
kind of
way.
going there. I know this is also going to be vague, and it's not that clarity that is always wanted. I've seen several that just say throughout the school environment. I know that, but we're not talking about kids who need intensive interventions. We're talking about kiddos who are getting close to that point of transitioning back to full gen ed. So we want to kind of think about that. You really need to think about that individual student. What does that student need to get that intervention? And you want to be somewhat vague, yet specific at the same time. And I say that because your student could leave your school district and come to my district, and what you say as a therapy room, we may not have a therapy room in the district that I'm at because of space. Does that, I know we're not giving you a very clear, direct answer. So we will continue to look into that and provide additional guidance that maybe we can get from ODE or OEC on those, and then send that out. And we're going to do a follow-up email with questions from both this morning and this afternoon for anything that we're not getting 100% answers for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I know the preschool world's a little different, so.
Preschool is very different. And and it also depends what kind of preschool classroom do you have. That's going to look very different depending on under the new guidance of preschool rules too, so.
Okay, thank you.
So it just says Metzler here. Can you explain to us what you mean by an administrative assistant leading a study for for IEP students only?
We have a study hall that only IEP students go to. Is there a way to list that on the IEP, or we should just leave it off because it's not a licensed teacher?
Is it part of
Kinda
their,
like a tutor session?
is it part of their schedule?
Yes.
It would just, then it would just go on their schedule. There's no real way to list a non-licensed person.
Okay.
Right. And they're
I
not
would make
providing
sure-
direct instruction, correct?
Yes, I would
No,
make
they're
sure
not.
that they're not providing SDI.
Yeah, as long as they're not providing direct instruction, you're good, fine to go there.
Okay.
Along those lines, I have another question. There was discussion at another SST in a IEP session around specially designed instruction being provided by gen ed teachers in the gen ed classroom. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, Deborah, you win the prize. We were trying to avoid this question being asked. Deborah wins the prize today. So
Actually, Emily does. She sent me it in a direct message, so.
Okay. That counts for half a prize, Emily, but anyways, just in lieu of time, we only have about 15 minutes left and a ton of slides. I'll answer this real quick, and then if we need to expand on this later, just please reach out. ODE made a very brazen statement about 18 months ago. Leadership that is currently not there made a statement, a pretty big audience, about gen ed teachers not being able to provide specially designed instruction. There's nothing explicitly stated in the Ohio operating standards that says they can or cannot, and there's nothing really in the federal regulations that says they can or cannot. IDEA, however, says that general education teachers can, but the states do have some leeway in overriding federal law with state operating standards. Being that it's not written in the operating standards, ODE is not holding districts to that currently. I don't know if this is on their list of updates come the new operating standard, new revision of the operating standards. For now, we can't really give any further yes or no to this section. I would consult with your legal counsel to see what their interpretation is and how they can, what they're able to defend if it were to come to that. Unfortunately, this has huge implications, and the ruling is, we have been told that it is sitting with the legal counsel at the Department of Education, which kind of operates on their own timelines, not understanding necessarily the implications it has in schools. So we do not have further guidance on that now. Unfortunately, as soon as we do, we will make sure to push that information out to you. But like I said, we only have about 12 minutes, so I'm going to go through these slides. Totally understand this might feel rushed, so if there's any follow-up you or your district feel like you might need, we can definitely arrange for that.
Yeah, and please keep adding questions to the chat, because we're saving this chat at the end, and if there's anything we don't get to, we will get those answers back out to you.
The time, the beginning and the end date can be left blank if it's presumed, if the end dates are the same as the IEP. Double check this though, as some programs auto-populate this. The amount of time and instruction will be given towards the implementation of the goals, not the amount of time in a class, which I already hit on. And the frequency of service aligned with the amount of time can be daily, weekly, or monthly. Just be specific. If you just write 220 minutes, nobody knows really what that means. Related services, that next part down, related services is means the transportation and such developmental, corrective, and other supportive services required to assist the child that with a disability to benefit from special education. Each related service is placed in its own box. Keep that in mind. Amount and frequency applies to the amount of time and instruction with provided regarding the goals listed. Amount of related service a student receives is individualized to their need, and the location must be clearly identified. A related service can be a standalone, specially designed instruction. We often see this with speech. For example, if the student's primary disability is identified as speech or language impairment and the only service provider is the SLP, then speech services are considered the SDI and are listed in that box. Assistive technology, the definition of assistive technology is there, straight from the operating standards. This includes devices and both devices and services, both high tech and low tech, such as calculators and pencil grips. Must describe how and when it's going to be used. Proprietary names should not be used, and a surgically implanted device such as cochlear implant or a pacemaker is not assistive technology. Again, here's the definition of assistive technology as a device. Assistive technology service is a service that directly assists a child with a disability in selection, acquisition, or use of assistive technology device. Accommodation means changing the way the materials are presented to that student, as well as the setting, timing, or scheduling with the expectation that the student will reach a standard set for all students. Accommodations such as, but not limited to, the following: the presentation, how you present the materials, how they respond to the materials, the setting, timing, and scheduling, and the conditions or criteria for interventions. Accommodations change the way the materials are presented and the way they demonstrate their learning. The expectation is that they will reach the same learning standard as other students. Multiple accommodations can be listed in the same box. The conditions of the accommodation must be specified. The best example here is the use of extended time. Make sure you are specifying what that is. If it's 2 times the allowable limit, or by the end of the week, the academic quarter, whatever that means, and do not use terms such as needed. One-on-one direct aid services is documented under accommodations according to the Universal Support Material Transcript, and there is your citation for that. There are accommodations. Keep in mind this slide, there are accommodations that can be allowable in the school setting, but not necessarily allowable in the state or district-wide testing. Keep that in mind when you're constructing accommodations for a student, such as like on a test. If those accommodations aren't allowable on state testing and or SATs, PSATs, ACTs, those things you have to make sure you know the difference between those. Those SATs and ACTs have their own accommodation manuals that differ in some instances, and they may not, some allowable accommodations in a school classroom setting may not be allowed for those tests. There's definitions or examples of accommodations. Modifications, on the other hand, means changes made to the content that the students are expected to learn from, whether it's the amount or complexity of the materials being altered. Modifications are such as, but not limited to, the effect that affect the content, selection of key components to be taught, alteration of evaluation material and criteria, and alteration of performance criteria. Modifications change the amount, reduce work requirements, and or complexity. If a student is being instructed using the extended standards, it should be noted in this section under modifications that they're under the extended standards, as that would be considered a modified curriculum. Support for school personnel. The area documents interaction between adults, identify the specific support by whom and when it will occur. Consultation is considered support for school personnel. So if there's a student maybe that has been removed from OT, PT, or speech services, and consultation is still, in some situations, consultation is advised or offered, make sure you are including that in and listing it specifically as a consultation instead of like a one-on-one type service for that student. And then an aid is also listed in accommodations. Services to support medical needs. Medical services that the child needs to receive FAPE can include medications that's dispensed during the school days, or certain things like intermittent catheterization, a feeding tube, or breathing therapy. May or may not be tied to specific goals. It may also include school health services and nurse services. And that's not necessarily something like student gets a headache and goes to the nurse, unless that is impeding their opportunity to receive FAPE. If it's certain things like a tracheotomy or a trach, sometimes a vibrating vest, or whatever it may be, those are the things that would need to be listed there. Transportation as a related service. Transportation as a related service needs to be considered when the transportation would differ for that student, whether it's to or from provider services or extra support they may need on the school bus, the van, however they may get to school, that's outside of what it would be if they were a non-disabled student. Make sure you are listing specifically if there is outside of the selections that ODE has listed, what that may be. Non-academic and extracurricular activities. For this section, in what ways does a child have the opportunity to participate in non-academic and extracurricular activities? Describe that. The student, would have the same opportunities as their non-disabled peers. Be careful writing things in here, like the student will participate in football with an aide, or be the manager for the football team with an aide, because then the district is then on the hook to provide that aid. There are certainly some instances where that does become acceptable, because it is what is going to allow that student to participate in those activities. So just keep that in mind there. General factors, the IEP team considered, and keep in mind when you're filling out this general factors that the parent needs to have input, as they are a member of that IEP team. Least restrictive environment. For this statement, the presence of a disability alone is not a reason for removal. A statement here needs to be listed explicitly as to why the decision was made to place that student in the environment they are in, and how it allows them to access the general education curriculum, or what barriers in, say, for instance, a general education classroom provide that would not allow that student to be successful. So you just have to justify it based on the team decision and supporting evidence, but keep in mind, don't just list the disability category here. We see that more times than we probably should, where the disability category is listed, and that is not justifying removal. Needs to be based on the needs of the child. The nature and severity of the disability is such that the education and regular education classes, even with the use of aids and services, cannot be achieved satisfactorily. If testing occurs away from non-disabled peers, list that in accommodations in section 7 and LRE in section 11. That is directly from the universal support material. And then there are no further questions to respond to in this setting. In this section, sorry. For the justification, explain why the instruction or service cannot be delivered in the general education setting with non-disabled peers. Make sure in that description is supported by some evidence in the specially designed instruction section as to how you're going to provide that support for the student to reach the participate in the general education curriculum. And then once again, the disability, do not simply just put the disability definition there. State and district-wide testing. Here's where you would list the accommodations that the student is going to be provided on testing. District and statewide testing might look different based on allowable accommodations. There is an accommodations manual for both the general state test as well as the alternate assessment that is available on ODE's website. If here on this section, the biggest piece is if you are, if it's been determined that this student is a student with this most significant cognitive disability and is participating in the alternate assessment, then you must click below the guidance. Obviously, the AASCD is alternate assessment and participation criteria, and go through the framework that is going to support that decision for that student. Keep in mind, the most significant cognitive disabilities are the students that are qualifying for the alternate assessment. At the end of the day, it is a team decision, so we cannot say, yes, this student is, or no, this student isn't. The only questions you would get into is if a student is maybe listed as SLD and all of a sudden they show up on alternate assessment, or if the student is put on alternate assessment because of behavior problems, or you don't, the staff thinks they might not be successful in the general assessment. That's a big no-no there, and that is why that AASCD participation criteria becomes so crucial. Here's the link to that decision-making tool that will ask guiding questions in a rubric form, allowing you to make the decision as a team. This form should be filled out, ideally with the team, to get all pertinent input. And this will help you kind of go through those questions that will lead you to either make the decision to put them on alternate assessment or not. Exemptions, section 13, here's where you would list if the student is exempt from their test. Keep in mind some of the assessments have different exemption rules, so just make sure you are looking through there. Guidance manual for the 3rd grade reading guarantee will give you all the pertinent information you need there. Meeting participants, there is a new drop-down menu that allows you to select position. Parents must be afforded the opportunity to participate. If they do not participate in that meeting, that just note that somewhere, especially absolutely note it in the PRO1. Alternative means is for participation must be documented. And team member excusal, this must be agreed upon by the parent and the school district prior to the IEP meeting. We get the question is, before the meeting starts, is that prior to the IEP meeting, that determination is going to be left up to you and your legal counsel as to what they are able to defend. Excused members must provide input in the development of the IEP in writing to both the district and the parent prior to the meeting. So if it is a required team member and they are not able to be in that meeting, the excusal form must be complete, and the person is expected to provide input in their given area. Signature page, pretty self-explanatory. I either give consent to initiate special education, I agree to give consent, except, or I do not agree to give consent. And there's different sections, whether it's initial IEP, annual review, or a change of placement. The procedural safeguards, also currently called the Guide to Parents' Rights, must be offered at every meeting to that parent, even if that parent has received 15 copies of it. Just make sure you're making them aware of it and offering it there so they are aware of that. Copy of the IEP must be provided to that parent within 30 days of that meeting, according to the operating standards. If you choose to provide the copy at that meeting, just mark that there. And under yes or no, if it's not, or it needs revisions, or it will be sent at a later date, just enter that in. If you have questions about visual impairments, we can address that separately. We are a couple minutes over. Here's the Guide to Parents' Rights in Special Education. You guys have all seen that. And here is our contact information. Please reach out. I apologize, we ran over. It's not always a bad thing. We got a lot of great questions, some great conversation today. The recording will be available sometime next week, early part of next week, hopefully, once it can go through edits and revisions and accessibility. And if you, like I said, again, if you have questions, we can stay on a few minutes now and answer some of those questions. I want to be respectful of your time, but if you have questions at a later date, please send them to any one of the people on this list. David's more of our career tech expert in special education. So if you have career tech special ed specific questions, I would include him. Other than that, the top any of these 4 people are certainly appropriate to reach out and contact. Thank
And I
you.
dropped.
I know that was a
Yep.
lot. What's that? I think. I
No,
just
it
gonna
was
say-
me talking, Steve. Yeah, I said I
Okay.
dropped the link again to the survey. We didn't get it dropped in early in the ETR, but to get your certificate of attendance, you do need to complete that survey and it'll be emailed to you right away. And you can do it as well for your ETR training if you were in that this morning, if you missed it. It is also in your email from your original confirmation from Tina Forshee as well.
Steve, you're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry. I was saying thank you for being with us today. I know it was a extremely long day. Most of you guys were on both sessions. This is, we could have had a full day training on ETR and IEP. I encourage you to look at the universal support materials, as well as you can go back and review the slides that were provided, and the recording will be available next week. But thank you very much. Wishing you the best this year. If you have any questions at any time, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We will do our best to get you the guidance that you need. And we hope you all have a great afternoon. I'm going to stop the recording, but like I said, we will be on if anybody has any questions they need to follow up on.